And I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Brian to kick us off.
Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for allowing me to do this, Dion. It's my pleasure to introduce Gary Gruver. Gary is the author of several books, most recently Engineering the Digital Transformation. And I met Gary when he came with Damon Edwards and Gene Kim to Walmart in 2015. And I had a conversation where I told him the trunk-based development was stupid. And he explained to me that I was wrong. And I believed him because of the work he'd done with HP LaserJet firmware, which there's an excellent article on that at IT Revolution's website. And it's kind of set me on the path I'm on today, which is why Gary is not allowed to buy beer around me. So without any further ado, Gary Gruver.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks for hosting me in this. This is in my opinion, a pretty special group of people. Having led large-scale transformations in big organizations, I understand how hard what you're trying to do is, and I appreciate it. And anything I can do to help you and champion this to enable you to be successful, that's where my passion and energies are. So getting an opportunity to talk with this community, I think is a privilege for me. And hopefully the content I'm providing is helpful. And I'll stick around as long as people have questions, because one, I got nowhere else to go, and two, my wife's really getting tired of talking about DevOps. So with that, do you believe how you develop and deliver software is becoming more and more important to the success of your company? And do you believe that as an organization, you can become much more efficient and effective with software? But when you try to drive change, it's hard to get alignment across the organization on the changes that will provide the most benefit. And then when you do make an investment, it's hard to quantify the improvements and demonstrate the value to the business so that they'll invest more in continuous improvement. If you answered yes to these questions, you're like most of my clients. You understand software is important, you know you can do better, but you struggle to drive that improvement. And as a dojo community, you're probably doing better than most in terms of knowing what needs to change and making the changes. But at some level, you're probably still struggling to engage people and get them to commit to the resources and embrace new ways of working. What if instead of your team having to push these ideas for how to change, the people out in the organization around you were excited about driving the change because they knew these changes were going to help them become successful in achieving their objectives, and that they were pulling help from your teams instead of you trying to push the organizational change management part of that. If these people had a common systematic approach for analyzing a broad range of applications, for making the opportunities for improvements visible to everyone, an approach that went beyond just implementing the latest Agile and DevOps practices to addressing their unique challenges. And what if this systematic approach could engage the entire organization in the continuous improvement journey, which is important for a couple of reasons. First, because software is so hard to see and measure, you're going to need everyone's perspective. You're going to need the executives championing these new ways of working and investments. You're going to need managers finding the capacity and the resources to make it happen. And you're going to need the engineers that are closest to the work, their perspective, to really understand where the waste and inefficiency is. Second, because it's important to engage everyone, because getting people to embrace these new ways of working is going to require getting them to commit to these new ways of doing things. And it's really hard to tell people what to do and get them to do it. It's much better if you can point out the problem, identify it, and get them to engage in coming up with a solution. In that case, they're much more likely to embrace the new ways of working. And even if it doesn't work perfectly the first try, they're much more likely to adjust it and modify their approach to figure out how to make it work. That's the goal of engineering the digital transformation, is to provide a more systematic approach for continuous improvement with software that has engineering rigor that can scale across a large organization. And I'm excited to be talking to this group because I think if you had this framework, your job gets so much easier and you're in there helping them implement instead of trying to convince people to change. The first step for me in the, oops, I'm not, hold on, technical difficulty. All right. The first step in the process for me is making it visible. You know, if you go into a manufacturing line, you can see inventory building up, you can see waste, you can see quality problems. If you go into a place making software, you see a bunch of people sitting around in cubicles or open desk around computers. And one of the biggest things that we need to do is, if we're going to get people aligned on what needs to be fixed, is we need to make that process visible. And from my experience in working with a lot of different organizations, different applications, different architectures have different issues. So we can't just copy what was done for a small team of 5 people and try to make it work in a large complex system that has hundreds of people working together. And this was one of the biggest motivations for creating this systematic approach, is that I saw too many people trying to copy what worked for 5 people into large groups, and it wasn't working very well. And from my opinion, you need to start with the problem you're trying to solve before implementing the solution. And I found the best approach for making it visible is documenting the deployment pipeline. David Farley and Jez Humble came up with the continuous delivery book. That whole process of going from a developer checking in code to being released in production, and trying to figure out, how do we think about that deployment pipeline, and how do we enable that to release code on a more frequent basis while enabling all aspects of quality. And this presentation is going to focus on that. The book covers more broader pieces of the value stream, but this is really going to focus on that area. And the classic example is a loosely coupled deployment pipeline where a group of small people can work together and independently develop, qualify, and deploy code without going through an integrated test environment. And this is a lot of what you hear talked about in the DevOps community. You're able to do A/B testing, everybody wears a pager, canary releases, you want to go to microservices. And this works really well. My experience in having, I did a large scale transformation with 800 people at HP doing embedded firmware. And I went from there to Macy's right about the time Jez came out with the continuous delivery book, and was trying to do it with a few thousand people working together on a large complex system. And the types of things that I was hearing when I talked to Gene and Jez were not the types of things that work very well in a large complex system. And I was fortunate enough that Jez was down the street from where I worked at Macy's, and he'd read my book and I'd read his book just about when the continuous delivery book came out, my first book, A Practical Approach to Large Scale Agile. And we started kind of getting together, and I couldn't afford to pay for him to have ThoughtWorks come in and do consulting, but I could buy him beer. Like Brian buys me beer, I could buy him beer, and we'd get together and I said, okay, Jez, when you wrote this book, you did it for 40 people. I've got like 3,000. How are you thinking this would work? And we'd have long debates about it. And a lot of stuff he described were, people wearing pagers, but when you've got 3,000 people, you don't know who made the change. So I got into this mode of arguing with Gene and Jez about some of the things they described for DevOps worked really well for a small, loosely coupled team, but it didn't seem like the right similar approach for large, tightly coupled. And after arguing about this with these guys for 4 or 5 years, in 2017, the DORA report went out and tested for it. And what they came out is the biggest indicator of DevOps success is having a loosely coupled architecture. And if you read the Accelerate book, I think it's chapter 5 is all on that loosely coupled architecture thing. And my conclusion of that is, great, now we can start talking about how to do DevOps for large, tightly coupled systems differently. And their response was, no, we've got to convince everybody to loosely couple their architecture, which is great if you can. And I'm fundamentally a true believer, if you can loosely couple the architecture, managing small things is much easier and less complex than managing large things. But having led a large scale sort of completely re-architecture of 10 million lines of code at HP, it was one of the hardest, most difficult things I've ever done. And going into organizations, I looked at, there's lots of opportunity to get better at releasing code more frequently while enabling all aspects of quality without completely re-architecting it first. And I fundamentally believe if you have a good, strong deployment pipeline in place as your guardrails, it gives you more safety measures for when you start to do an evolutionary change to the architecture. So what you're hearing from me is probably a little different than what you hear from those guys, but I think diversity of thought is where innovation comes from. And so I continue to put new and unique thoughts out there based on my experience. So the reality when I go into organizations is, yes, there will be some groups with small, loosely coupled systems, and doing DevOps for these is fairly easy. But in reality, what I tend to see more of is these large, tightly coupled systems that are really integrated together. And when you look at how the deployment pipeline works, it looks a lot more like this, where you have individuals developing, committing to a subsystem, going into QA, UAT, staging, and production. And we need to start by making visible how we're really doing that development now before we start trying to implement how we would change it. So my belief and my experience in working with a lot of organizations is the types of things that you do to fix a large, tightly coupled system are very different than empowering a team of 5 to 7 people to own their own destiny and drive things and make things happen. So the first step for me is always making the process visible, and that includes branching. You know, a lot of my analogies go from my manufacturing backgrounds, the types of things they do there. If you had an automobile factory that was having quality problems and you couldn't get enough done delivered to the customers quick enough, you wouldn't go build another factory next to it to sort of get more done. But in software, because it's so easy to create another factory next to it, we tend to do this where we branch the code and we basically duplicate our manufacturing process for software. And there's a lot of waste and inefficiencies with that. There's reasons why you have these branches, but as you can move to building in quality, you can understand those and eliminate them over time. So I don't think that the people closest to the work frequently understand the waste and inefficiencies, or they just understand that they have to do it that way. If you step back and if you're trying to make improvements, I think not only do we want to make the factory visible and how it works, but we want to know the duplication of work that's associated in the system. And that's for a large, tightly coupled system. I've got a lot of experience doing embedded systems from HP and consulting with clients. And then a deployment pipeline for embedded systems is going to be very different. You've got code that can be developed on a simulator that can be common branch. You've got emulator, low-level firmware that works on an emulator that's working on custom hardware. And then you've got to qualify it on the product. And frequently you don't own the deployment process. So the types of things that you would do to release code on a more frequent basis while enabling all aspects of quality are going to be different for this. And if you look at it in general, different types of applications, different types of architectures have different challenges. And before we look at just copying what was done by somebody else and assuming it's going to make our organization more efficient, more effective, I believe the first step in driving a continuous improvement journey is just making the process visible to everyone so they can have a common understanding of what the opportunities are for improvement. The next biggest change that I think is fundamentally changing how software works is really shifting to the ability to build in quality. I think it's one of the biggest breakthroughs. You know, manufacturing would no more build up a bunch of automobile parts, wait 6 months, and then try to assemble them and see if they work together. But software historically has gone to this mode of batching up large amounts of inventory and inspecting in quality later. If Deming saw what a lot of large organizations were doing with software, he'd be rolling over in the grave at this whole approach to inspecting in quality. And this building in quality is where I see most organizations struggle. And they start trying to build in quality before they create a stable quality signal. And what we're asking people to do when we're trying to build in quality is we're asking them to respond to the feedback from the testing or what we're doing there. And what I see happens and what I see most implementations fail is when there's a lot of instability in the test environment and the deployment process and the environments. People will try to embrace these new ways of working, but when they waste a bunch of time debugging and triaging things that are outside of their control, they'll end up giving up and sort of escalating into the business that they can't get the value that they want because we're wasting a lot of time doing this DevOps thing and we really just need to get past it and go back to doing the same thing. So this is probably one of my second biggest motivations for coming up with this systematic approach, is just watching so many people struggle with that. So I've come up with a test that I recommend people do, and it really starts with, let's find some place on that deployment pipeline. We're going to find an environment, and I want to run my tests, and I want to check for repeatability. So take all the automated tests that you have, run them 20 times in a row, and put the results in the database and see what you get. Ideally, you'd have a bunch of tests that pass all the time because you have good code, and you'd have a bunch of tests that fail all the time because you've got a defect that needs to be fixed. In reality, this is what I see most of the time. I see some stable tests that are good. I see some tests that are finding a defect consistency, but I see lots of tests that are toggling between passing and failing on an ongoing basis. And if you try to ask developers to build in quality when they have unstable tests, they're going to end up wasting a lot of time and energy, and they're going to give up, and it's going to get inefficient. So we need to take these tests that are flaky, and we need to set them aside to get reworked. And we need to take our tests that are constantly failing, we need to set them aside till we get the defect fixed. And as I go into organizations, a lot of times I struggle with people who say, no, we can't do that. They're providing coverage. To my point is, I think what they're teaching people to do is they're either teaching them to ignore test failures, or they're teaching them to waste a lot of time and energy doing work and effort that's not adding any value to them. So I strongly recommend setting them aside until you get them fixed. And what we really need to do is teach people to start using the feedback before we start worrying about coverage, and make sure they're stable. The next test I have them run is, can you run these tests 20 times in a row in random order and get the same answer? And what I frequently find is organizations have built in order dependencies in their tests, so they can't break them up and run them in random order. And in this situation, I think you need to resolve those things, and again, set the ones that have order dependencies aside to get reworked, and take the ones that you know are stable and reliable. Now we're going to take those tests and we're going to run them in parallel against this environment and put them under load. And I've seen more organizations struggle here than anywhere else. And this isn't recommendations that you're going to hear from somebody that doesn't stay with the client until they implement it. I've seen flaky F5s in the system that are giving random answers. I went to one client that had 3,000 tests they ran every weekend, and they'd analyze them on Monday. And I was like, great, we've got all those tests, let's run them every day. And the guy from India said, I can't do that, you'll kill me. I said, how come? I said, well, I run 3,000 on the weekend. I spend all week long analyzing and debugging them to figure out which ones are really defects, because I have so many timeouts in the system. My environment doesn't have enough memory, and it doesn't have enough CPU capacity. And I'm like, hold on, could we just get this guy a larger environment so he doesn't time out? The types of things that I've seen. Tommy Mauser, who wrote my second book with me, when I came up with this, I called him back 2 months later, and it pissed him off. And he finally figured out, I can't even build the same thing twice, because I'm looking to common open source libraries, and they're changing without me knowing it. So he didn't think about the idea that he had to put the open source in a repository and change it at the rate that he wanted if he wanted to be able to consistently run the same thing over again. So as you run this experiment, I think you'll find things that you'll be surprised by. And those are things that are slowing down your organization every day. But if we're really going to increase the frequency, you're going to die under the load of these things. Next thing is do the same thing and deploy the code and then run the test, deploy the code and run the test. If you can do that, then you've got a good deployment process that's repeatable and reliable. If you can't have a good, repeatable and reliable deployment process, developers are going to waste time debugging the deployment process and get frustrated. The next step is do the same thing with create an environment first, then deploy the code, then run the automated test. These are the types of things that we can and should be automating with DevOps. And what this test does is it highlights the biggest challenge for your specific organization or your specific deployment pipeline. And it enables them to focus on fixing the things that are slowing them down the most. And I feel it's really important that you start there, because you need to gain positive momentum with your transformation if it's going to be successful. Another way to look at this is you could come up with similar data if you had good Pareto charts with root causes of the types of root causes that you have that you're finding defects when they're in these environments when you're running tests. And in this case, if you're dominated by test issues, environment issues, and deployment issues, I can guarantee your transformation is going to fail if you ask people to start responding to this feedback from testing until you get this stuff resolved. And it's going to be different if you've got a small team of 5 to 7 people that really own the thing end to end, because they can own the deployment and the environment and everything else. But if you've got a larger, tightly coupled system and you're asking people to respond to this feedback that's outside of their control, they're going to get frustrated and give up after a while. So when you look at automation priorities, you can either do it with the steps to expose issues, or you can do it with the Pareto issues, but you're really focusing in on improving your test automation design and your test data, analyzing root cause instability, automating your deployment processes, automating your infrastructure creation. And it's going to take a while for most organizations to resolve these things. There's a good case study in the book about Ted Ewell at Optum, who he went down this journey and had a team of about 104 people that was working against large back-end systems in a huge organization, and just all the back-end systems going down on him was killing him. And he went on a 3-year journey of cleaning this up and moving to OpenShift and knocking out the back-end systems and cleaning up his test automation. That in itself can be a pretty good journey for most people. And then once we have a good, stable quality signal that the majority of the time is finding code issues, then we can ask developers to be responding to that feedback. And what's unique in software is we don't really need to stop the line or pull the andon cord when we have a defect. We can just gate the code. It's not the process that's creating the defect. It's a developer that wrote some code that had some unintended consequences. So instead of shutting down the whole line with gated code, we can take that code that had unintended consequences and send it back to the developer to get fixed while we open up the gate to continue to promote the good code forward. So if you've got a team of 5 to 7 people, yeah, stop the line, everybody scramble to get the bill green. If you've got a large organization like at HP, we were doing this with 400 to 800 people, you really can't stop the line, but ideally you want to make sure that that bad code isn't getting into your downstream environments and make it unstable. And you want to give the feedback to the developer as quick as you possibly can so that they can improve. As Deming would say, our job as leaders is to design systems that enable our employees to be successful. And in this case, the way that we enable employees to be successful is we try to give them the best high quality feedback that we can as quick as we possibly can in the process. And we can gate this at the code, or if we have a large tightly coupled system, we can gate this at each individual state. And I gate with what I called our build acceptance test. Some people call them smoke tests. Pick your terminology, but it's the fastest running quick set of tests that you can use to provide the highest quality feedback there. The reality is once you've been doing this for a while, HP, we had, I think it was like 15,000 hours of automated tests I could run on a server every day. And you just don't have the ability to debug and triage all those every time, and you can't gate code on that. So we took a small subset of those tests and we gated the code, and we put the rest of the tests into a database that we had a graphical view of. And we created something that I'm now calling product control charts. And these product control charts are different than process control charts that you use in manufacturing, in that they don't show dimension or tolerance, but they show passing rates. And if you do a good job of labeling your test in a way that it identifies the people who should lead the debug and triage process, then you can quickly identify issues. And at HP, this was 12 years ago, 15 years ago, I was able to look and, a test label would maybe be fax, or it would be print, or it would be paper handling. When I saw a quick drop in the test passing rates, I could double click on, something like this over here where the builds are, a build to drop, and I could look at who checked in code. And the organization started calling me the Eye of Sauron, because I could, as a leader over 800 people, within 30 minutes of somebody checking in code, I could be in their code and say, well, you broke all this stuff. What was going on? What were you thinking? I wasn't really beating them up, but I was trying to learn what was working and what's not working. And as you have a deployment pipeline with a bunch of different things, you can also look at your control charts cross environment. So you can look at the tests that were passing in a QA environment where maybe you had the backend systems mocked out. And then you can look at where you go into an integrated QA environment, and you can see that as I moved in my integrated QA environment, my backend card system is down and I'm not getting very good pass rates there. And then ideally in this situation, potentially you could double click on that backend service and see which services were down or which services were giving you a problem. And when you get a large number of automated tests, you really can't afford to manually be debugging and triaging them all unless they're unit tests that are quick to find. And you need a much more systematic approach to debugging and analyzing a group of tests. And these product control charts enable you to do that. And so the first step is getting a stable quality signal. The second step is finding some good build acceptance tests to start gating the code. And then these processes, you know, your product control charts across builds looks for things that are getting through your build acceptance test. And your cross environment tests enable you to quickly debug and triage environment issues and see where you're not doing a very good job of building in quality. Make sense? Okay. So once I understand what my process looks like and I'm starting to build in quality, now I can start optimizing code. And one of the challenges I've always had with software is it's so hard to measure because everything's a different size, a different shape. And what I tended to do is I spent a lot of time out in my organization getting a qualitative feel for what was slowing people down and what was getting in the way. And we'd set objectives and we'd drive towards those. And when things weren't getting done, I'd be wandering around trying to figure out, why didn't this get done? And it wasn't like, why didn't this get done? You're in trouble. It was like, no, we both thought it was important. What happened that this didn't get done? And the first time I'd walk into somebody's cube, they're like, dude, you're like my boss's boss's boss. What are you doing here? And it's like, well, I just want to understand why it didn't get done, or why what you checked in broke everything and you didn't get good feedback. And I started learning from that, and we started using that to prioritize what we did for continuous improvement. And my assumption was, as I went and started coaching other large organizations, I just teach executives to do what I did and spend a lot of time out in the organization getting the qualitative feel. And I'm not a real quick learner, but after 3 or 4 years of trying that, I realized that I just really wasn't very successful getting the executives to spend time out there doing that. The other thing that I realized is in a large organization, there's value in having metrics that can help drive behavioral changes. But the problem I had with software is, you know, how are you going to measure flow? And if you measure it in terms of lines of code turmoil, I can copy and paste better than anybody and create some really inefficient code. If you want to measure it in terms of story points, well, I used to go get a cup of coffee for a story. Now I stand up, I walk down the hall, I open the door, I go into, how many story points did you say you needed to prove the productivity improvements you'd like to see? I can game any of those systems. So I think that's one of the challenges with software compared to manufacturing. Is in manufacturing, you can see everything coming down the line, you can see the flow, you can see things happen. In software, everything's a different size, different shape. And I've come to the conclusion that while we've been wrestling with this for 30 or 40 years, I've just taken a different approach. I can't measure flow, but I think I've gotten pretty good at measuring the waste that's slowing down flow. And so from my perspective, one of the big sources of waste is the delay in feedback. So once we've mapped out the deployment pipeline, what I try to do is say at the bottom, you can see how long does it take to move from one environment to the next and make that piece happen. And you can see down here that this is, you know, it takes to get into the subsystem environment takes a week. To get into the QA environment takes 4 weeks. To get over here takes 5 weeks. And then once I know the cycle time that it takes to get into the different environments, I start looking for the percentages of defects that are found in that environment. And then in this case, if I'm waiting 4 weeks to find 60% of my defects, can we really expect our developers to get better and improved? Have we done what Deming said in terms of creating a system where our employees can be successful? Or do we need to look at either improving the speed of flow into this environment so it's not 4 weeks, it's 1 week or 3 days, or finding more of these defects closer to the developers where they're either easier to debug and triage? So any delay in feedback is waste and inefficiencies in the system that we can measure. We can make a change and we can quantify that we had an improvement, and we can go to the business and show that we had an improvement and get them to invest in the next level of continuous improvement. Again, back to the Pareto chart, anything that we're finding here is not code can and should be automated, which reminds me of Jez Humble's joke, my favorite joke from Jez Humble. Do you know what servers do when they find out that you're manually doing something that's easy to automate? They sit up in the server room and drink beer and laugh at you at night. The first time you do it, do it. The second time you do it, automate it. The third time you do it, write a test. It's a very simple process and step, but anytime we're asking people to debug and triage test issues is a waste of time. That should be easily be able to automate and be efficient. Anytime people are spending debugging and triage environment issues or deployment issues, they're wasting their time. So this is waste that we can quantify. And when we go to Docker containers, we should expect this environment issues to go way down. When we clean up our test framework, we should expect that. And so when we prioritize going after something and we have this metrics, we can go back to the organization and say, and look at the waste and inefficiencies we were able to get out of the organization. And here's our next level of waste that we want to do next time. And I think if you do it this way, you're much more likely to get people to invest in the continuous improvement journey and the next step in the process. The next thing is you can use product control charts over time to show test passing rates. And this is a classic example where you've got 4 different projects coming into a release, and you can see that, you know, the redesigned UI should have been kicked out of that release. Its quality was so bad and it took it so long to get together that basically by keeping that project in that release, you've held the other projects hostage and delayed the time that it takes for them to get out there. So this is a good means for showing the waste and inefficiencies with that. And another big waste that manufacturing consistently sees is inventory. Anytime you walk into a manufacturing facility and you see inventory laying around, you see waste, you see inefficiencies, you see something that you know to be fixed. In software, we don't do a very good job of making that visible. And I think the waste and inefficiencies are just as large with software as they are with manufacturing with inventory. And we need to start making that visible by really trying to capture how many lines of code turmoil are sitting out on branches that haven't seen the other code that's on trunk and haven't had an opportunity to see the interactions between the two. And when we have that inventory sitting out there, we're delaying finding the interactions between the code and delaying the feedback to developers that we need to give them and they deserve to have. And the reason we leave it out here is because we haven't been building in quality, and this is the only stable place they know how to work. But as we get a stable quality signal and we start building in quality and we can make trunk more stable, then we can get rid of a lot of the waste and inefficiencies associated with this inventory and the duplications associated with branches. And one of the first steps is making that visible so people can engage in this process and see the value to it. All of this really requires creating a culture of continuous improvement. Oops. And, you know, as a dojo community, in a lot of cases, you know what needs to be done and you know how it needs to be done. It's just getting people there. And I think really to make that work, you need to make them part of the process. I'm not sure how many people have experience with Frederick Taylor, but he was the first person of the scientific work method, and he'd do time motion studies and he'd figure out the most efficient way to do things, and then he'd tell everybody how to do it. And while he got some productivity improvements, he got huge pushback from organizations because nobody wants to be told what to do. They want to be part of a solution. And if you look at what Ono did with the kata process at Toyota, he didn't tell anybody what to do. He came up with a systematic approach to continuous improvement. And he told everybody, your job's not just to do your job is to figure out how to do it better. And he embraced them in that design, and he taught that systematic approach. And because people were coming up with the ideas and implementing them, they were much more likely to embrace these new ways of change. And as you think about it from a DevOps community, you want to be more like Ono and less like Taylor, even though that we know the ideas. And part of that is creating a culture of continuous improvement that can engage everybody. And I know this is hard. I've done this. I've led large-scale transformations that delivered, 2 to 3x improvements in productivity. I get it, but this was such a breakthrough for me. It caused me to write a book, and I hate to write. I absolutely hate to write. And but it was such a breakthrough. I felt like we had to share it with others. And this was 12 years ago when this first book came out. And ever since I did this, it was such a breakthrough for the business and a breakthrough for me that all my passion and energy has been around trying to figure out how to help other people do it. And while I swore I'd never write another book, here's my fourth one. And I promised myself I'd never do this, but I'm so passionate about helping others that, I do keynotes, I write books, I do workshops, I do webinars, I do DevOps chats. And, I got to this book because after years of watching organizations struggle, I came to the conclusion that we needed more of a systematic approach to driving continuous improvement, more than just copying what other people were doing and hoping that it worked for them. And I know it's hard. I've done it. I get it. And the reason I'm so honored to get a chance to talk to this group is because you're the people in the trenches. You're the people driving this, and you're the people making this happen. I came out with this book and I came to the conclusion, well, everybody's going to read it. They're going to have a systematic approach. They're all going to align. They're going to be able to align on things. And, I did a big workshop in India for, a week long for 40 people. And I said, okay, you're a huge organization. How are you going to get to the rest of the people? And I said, do you want to, I can give you a volume discount on books. And they're like, well, that's interesting. How many do you have to get a volume discount? And this organization had thousands of people. I said, well, 50 books. And they're like, well, we'd never use that. That doesn't make sense. People don't read anymore. And I tried the same thing with Brian, and Brian said, yeah, I'm not falling for that trap. So again, I bought 3 crates of Accelerated and I passed them out to all the leaders, and they're all sitting on their desktops gathering dust.
Not all of them.
Not all of them, but a lot that it was hard, right? And so my latest idea was I really figured out, so how do we do this? And talking to people is like, well, what if I created a training and a certification process? Would that work? And I really resisted this for a long time because a lot of the certification processes in software aren't very rigorous or check the box, and they're different types of things. But I came up with this next approach, and it kind of models after Lean Six Sigma, which is, can we teach people how to think about software and development delivery as a process that can and should be continually improved, and provide a common approach for them to analyze a broad range of applications so people can quickly get aligned. And, I can do that. I can, and I do this in workshops, and I spend a lot of time coaching organizations on it. And that works, and it's a decent business model, but I can't scale to help as many people as I like, and it's kind of expensive for the clients. So what I did is I basically took a lot of what I do for workshops and I put it into a computer-based training model that's very cheap and efficient for people to train and take that remotely. And that's good. It's nice to teach people the concepts. But where I really think the value in what manufacturing learns is it really doesn't mean anything unless you start applying these principles in your own organization. And so for a Green Belt Lean Six Sigma in here, it requires a 4 to 6 month long improvement project with documenting the business results and the waste that you're able to eliminate. And it's kind of a self-generating ROI. And Dana, who I'm looking at here, is in the process of defining her Greenbelt project. And I think Brian's on his way. They both completed this. And then the idea is having a black belt either and recognize contributions for large multi-scale improvements or enable companies to be self-sufficient over time. Identify somebody like Brian or Dana in their organization that's going to, you know, learn what I do and take over certifying the green belts and be able to be self-sufficient, because I really don't want to spend all my time in Bentonville, although I hear they've got some new mountain bike trails down there. That's not really what I want to be doing. So this is kind of a framework that, one, is teach people how to think in a cheap and easy way, and then have your organization working with the people that are motivated enough to do an improvement project. So instead of you pushing the ideas on people, the training's out there and gets it there. And then people are coming to the dojo really ready and excited about implementing change. And so that you don't have to fight that resistance. And then, you know, I think I've got a little bit of a role to play in the beginning on the green belts to make sure that it has enough rigor to be consistent across the organization. But that's kind of the training I've come up with. And what I told Brian early on is, you know, I'm fond enough of the dojo community and the hard fight that they're fighting that every company I offered to give 2 free coupons for certification for you guys to try that out. And I don't know how you want to do that. He sent an email out to people and I had 3 people, maybe 4 people ask for a coupon of that. Brian's completed it. Brian, what do you think of the training?
Yeah, I thought it was incredibly valuable. In fact, one of our training people took it as well, and she thought it was incredibly valuable. And I'm trying to bring it into Walmart because it would solve a lot of, at least it would help the squishy middle problem I have.
And Dana, you're another white belt. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, it was really good, and so a couple of the takeaways that I had from it, because it was really good, isn't very helpful. It was not easy. It really made you think and apply what you can really learn from a lot of these different charts and things that you can create to really learn. Okay, my chart, if I'm looking at a scenario like X, then the first place I really want to tailor down and dive into would probably be here. So it helps really wrap your brain around the implementation. Even though you're not yet doing it for your own organization, it gives you various different scenarios from simple software to embedded systems that you have to really think about. And in addition to that, every time I listen to, whether it's this training, whether it's the Plutora webinars that Gary's been doing, this talk, there's always something that I glean from Gary's succinctness. There's things that like I know, and so I feel like, okay, yeah, well, it's repetitive, sure, I know this. But then I'll read something either in engineering digital transformation book or hear Gary say something in such a way that it's like, that is exactly how I need to explain it to people. The concept of inventory as risk and software sitting on a shelf is just a huge one that really just brought home a lot of things for me. And then there's just lots of other little tidbits where it's not new concepts, but it's new ways of approaching. And I think it's what it is the difference in that systematic approach to it versus just having the knowledge and like, okay, I want to do this, but the systematic approach and the way that it's presented gives you more, it gives me personally more powerful ways to say things and engage people within the organization.
What
she said?
I have a whole list of that. I've got, so I did a write-up when I took the training. And I have all things highlighted. I have like these, uh-oh,
What happened?
dogs turned off the power cord.
Oh.
Dogs just turned off our power, sorry. We had a little glitch. But yeah, so I have this thing, and I've got it highlighted in like 3 different colors, like, you know, concepts that I knew, but that I need to remember to reiterate to people, ideas that might be newer, like the inventory stuff, and then just like a bright highlight of like, this is how Gary phrased it, and this is the way I need to approach this because it just is so helpful. So I did get a lot from it, and I'm actually working with my manager right now on broadening out from my small development team, but working with our actual security program department to start a Greenbelt project that would be more than just limited to my small sphere, since I'm not actually part of the dojo.
And for me, taking the Beansters who presented at DevOps Enterprise several times, have been doing this since I convinced them to get off a truck or to develop on truck in 2015 and been on this journey hard. For them to learn something tells me I've created something with enough rigor that's of value. But my goal isn't necessarily to teach them more, although I'm happy that they got some insights and taught them more. But think about if all the community around you was at your level of understanding about how to analyze things and the benefits of changing things. How much easier would it be if they were all thinking in the same way and driving for similar changes? How much easier would your job be as a dojo if the executives and the managers were finding the capacity to make this happen and were driving help out of your teams because they figured they needed help figuring out how to write good test automation or setting up a Docker container, or Kubernetes, or any of those things. That's kind of the vision that I'm hoping to get there. And this is why I'm trying to give this to you guys to try, because I know what you're doing is really hard. And if there's something I can do to make it easier, I'd love to be able to help. Dion, that's kind of the pitch. I mean, we can go into questions. We can go into, if people are interested, you could just send me an email and I could send you a coupon for free training, or I could just give a coupon to everybody that's on the distribution. I don't want to violate the community, because it's not my community, and I treat the community you created with a lot of respect, because you're fighting the good fight. But I'd like to make this available to you if you want to try it, but I don't want to force it on you if you've got something that's working better for you.
Sure. I'll go ahead and work with Brian to make sure we get that information out to everyone. If you joined late, a couple things. We are recording this, so we'll make that recording available probably towards the end of the week, and I'll send out links to that. Also, I just posted in chat, if you joined late, we are gathering questions at slido.com. So if you go to slido.com, the URL is there, and the event ID is 47885. If you enter that, you can both add new questions and vote on other people's questions. We do have several questions, Gary, here. So the first one, Drew, since you put your name on that and
I did.
didn't enter it anonymously, do you want to go ahead and ask that? That was the #1 voted question.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if anonymous was supposed to be the model.
No.
Okay, great. Yeah, just the value stream question. And this is a Brian and I conversation Brian and I had too. I kind of feel badly when I see people write a value stream map with branches and merges and all that kind of thing, because to me a stream is a stream, kind of by definition. It's linear, it's single linear. I was wondering how you help people navigate that, whether you accept the branch idea in a process map of a value stream, or if you try to help people see that as a singular linear workflow to help them understand, make the process visible properly.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I see people do is they try to do value stream mapping like they did it for manufacturing, and it doesn't do a very good job of highlighting the issues. So kind of what you saw me mapping the deployment pipeline and putting metrics on it.
Yeah.
Could be called a value stream map. But when I go into organizations to review the value stream mapping, it's not really what I see. I see them tracking a requirement from one end to the other. And it doesn't necessarily highlight the issues with putting all those things together in a release.
Okay.
So from an ideation up to the code's been written, yeah, you can treat that like a value stream. And from the code's ready to release to deployed into production, that can maybe be more like it. But this thing in the middle, we've got to treat as a batch, right? What manufacturing does, which is unique, is each process either processes one item at a time or a batch items at a time. And software is unique is when we do the build, deploy process and release, the batch size is infinite. It's
Right.
whatever it shouldn't be, because it makes it really hard to triage it. And what we're doing with DevOps is try to go to smaller batch sizes to enable the triage to be more efficient. But that manufacturing process can handle whatever it is. And what I've tried to do is show that release process in a way that highlights the issues that I see as inefficiencies. And so some people can say, well, it's just value stream mapping. But as I see people go do value stream mapping, it doesn't show that. So there's a white paper. If you go to my tweets, you can follow a tweet to a white paper that sort of says, here's why value stream maps were done the way they were for manufacturing and business process engineering, and here's how software is different. And it led to me thinking about, those are very specific views of the deployment pipeline that I write, because what they do, and the metrics are very specific because they highlight the things that I see organizations doing wrong. And a lot of what Dana talked a little bit about is the scenarios that are in the training sort of says, if you have a value stream map that looks like this, and you have metrics that look like this, and you have this role, what should you prioritize fixing? So it enables people to see how to use the tools to identify issues. It also points out all the stupid stuff I've seen clients doing. So instead of you saying, don't do that, that's stupid, the training can sort of point out, well, here's, and it's classic examples that I see. And, the training is something people could go take on the website, or ideally, if you rolled it out in a large organization, it's the type of thing that could be integrated into your learning management system. It's SWARM compliant, which whatever that is, but it means that you could put it in just like your compliance training and require people to take it. And it's, you got to do this in Q1, Q2, or Q3. And then maybe you get down to, okay, Dion, out of your organization, I'd like to see 2 green belts this year. Okay. Brian, I'd like to see 4. Dana, I'd like to see 6. And you're not really telling people what to do. You're just telling them that I want to see you drive an improvement project, and I want to see you use these principles. So I don't know. Look at the white paper on the classic things I see when people do a value stream map doesn't show the classic things that I think are problems when people are trying to release code more frequently.
Okay.
Did that make sense?
I'll try and track that down, Gary, and I'll include that in the link to that white paper and the.
Oh, I can send it to you.
Okay, yeah, we'll include that in links to the video as well. So we'll try to gather all this information together. All right, the next question was posted anonymously, so I'll go ahead and read it. Which metrics for your pipelines do you find to best connect with leadership and the teams?
I think the whole process and just mapping out the environments, most of the time the leadership has no clue or idea of what's there. And they don't realize the issues associated. People are, those whole tests to figure out how to debug and triage to get a stable quality signal, I see more organizations wrestling with that on a day-to-day basis, and they don't realize the inefficiencies that are there. And when you put the map up there, and then you put all the issues that they're going after, and you can show that you make a change and it'll help them, I think that's where it really resonates. And And part of this is making the change and getting the fix. But a big part of the role that we got to play is we've got to market this stuff like crazy, right? We got to average, as soon as we got a win and we can show with metrics that it got better, we need to spend a lot of time sort of making that very visible to everybody, because you want people to do the next improvement and the next improvement, and the next improvement. And if they're not seeing the benefits and the wins for them, whether it's at the executive level or at the engineer level, people are gonna give up over time.
All right, Chris G, you're up next with your question about real-time visualizations.
So you may have already answered this, but I started in IT working in manufacturing. I developed real-time plant floor visualizations, basically.
Right.
And I've always thought when I came into DevOps, why don't we have something similar? I know we have Jenkins and we have all these other tools, but I've never really seen a tool that's as effective at kind of looking at what I will call the plant and sort of identifying where the bottlenecks are, you know, where we're starved, where we're having issues. You ever seen anything like that? Have you ever thought of anything like that, Gary? Why we couldn't apply something to an enterprise?
I created at HP, you know, that's how I became the eye of Sauron, is I could watch code move through the system. I could watch tests go down. I could drill up and down on the test passing rates. And, you know, I could be in Brian's cube 20 minutes after he committed code, wondering why he broke everything and sort of trying to learn from that. And it enabled me to drive the improvements that needed to be there. And when I went to Macy's, we had to hand build and grow our own. Platora had me doing a bunch of webinars because they're trying to do stuff that, you know, it sits on top of the database and enables you to visualize it. I don't know how far they've gotten on that journey. I haven't looked at it, but yeah, you're either going to need to create it or you're going to need to find it somewhere. And I haven't seen a great solution out there, but, you know, part of what I'm trying to do is make it visible and say, these are the views you need to have. And when I go into organizations, it's usually a fairly manual process to gather all that data up. And I think the opportunity is we have computers, this can be automated. We should be pulling this and making it visible to everybody. And that's going to be really helpful in getting people aligned to driving these changes. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more.
All right, James Simon, you're up next.
Yeah, so my first question is just, so if we were to do, if I were to do, let's say a greenbelt project,
Right.
I should do it with some improvement that has to happen at my employer?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do the white belt first and understand all the metrics and the approaches, and then reach out to me and say, here's my green belt project. And, you know, if you're a big employer and you're wanting to roll this out, you know, and you're trying to get more people trained, eventually I'd want to identify you know, Brian at your organization so that I can start teaching somebody to be a black belt, so that I don't have to be there coaching all the green belts, and you can be self-sufficient over time. I don't want to live in Bentonville, and James, I'm not sure where you live, but I don't think I want to live there either. So I want to get the methodology out there, and then, you know, it's not the perfect framework, but it took, you know, 40, 50 years for a lot of great minds to create a good framework for manufacturing. And I'm just trying to get a framework started and sort of engage people to improve it over time.
All right, next question. How does this work for legacy systems that don't have frequent changes, don't use pipelines, and most importantly, don't have build files?
Well, you've got to think about what your problem is. You know, if you're not going to change it at all, is it worth the investment? And one of the things I say is, let's start with where it's strategic and you're going to have business value, where you're going to have doing different things. But, you know, I was just in a large organization that has a big SAP system. Some guy had created 1,000 automated tests with a project. They run those automated tests once every 9 months. Could we maybe run them once a week and ask people to look at the data and look at the feedback? I mean, there's types of things that you can do to remove waste and inefficiencies without doing canary releases, A/B testing, and sort of DevOps is defined for loosely coupled systems. And in that environment, when you have COTS types applications, you either own the development or you own the deployment and customization. And there's different things you can do and different changes you have to make. And I think if you use these metrics, you can identify some simple things that can be done to improve, but it's got to be something that's critical enough to your business that it matters. And there's enough money being spent on it that it makes sense to invest in improving it.
All right, Roger Serby, you're up next.
Hey, I just wanted to say on behalf of the consortium, thanks so much for coming to be with us today. It's a great honor to have you with us. One of the things I like to ask is, as you consider modern software development as a whole, what's that one problem that keeps it in the back of your brain, keeps you from sleeping at night? What is it that's on your mind as you think about software development systems?
Yeah, I'd start by saying it's an honor to be here because while I'm just sort of talking and coaching people, you guys are the ones in the trenches fighting the good fight. So keep up the good work, and if there's things I can do to help you, it's great. Test automation. It's funny, if you read the book, there's a story that goes that Gold Rat, when they first started rolling out computers, did MRP systems. And Beyond the Goal, it's a great listen if you've never read Beyond the Goal. But he talks about MRP systems, which is how do you plan production, inventory, what parts to order, what to ship out of a manufacturing facility. And it was one of the first computer applications in the 80s, and they rolled it out at Black & Decker, and Black & Decker suddenly was operating with less inventory and better availability at lower cost than anybody ever thought possible. So the MRP companies sold MRP to all sorts of companies in the industry, and none of them were seeing improvements. And it was a productivity improvement because for a factory of 400 people, you typically have just 40 people manually crunching all that data and doing all the analysis. And so it made sense to automate it. Well, what he found is there was an inherent rule that people were incorporating into what they were doing that nobody knew about. And that was, we run MRP systems once a month. What Black & Decker had done is when they automated it, they enabled that MRP system to run 2 or 3 times a week. So they were using that increased capability of being able to run it more frequently to change how the entire organization runs. Everybody else who implemented MRP was using MRP to get efficiencies in the 40 people running the calculation once a month. What I see happening more and more in organizations is they use test automation the way they use the MRP system as they replace manual testing with automated testing, but they didn't change how the organization operated, and they didn't start building in quality. So as opposed to worrying about test coverage or any of those sorts of things, we need people to start responding to the feedback from that quality signal, and we need them to reacting to it, and we need to change the capabilities of the entire organization with test automation. And I don't see that happening very much. And when I do see people trying, if they try to move forward before they have a stable quality signal, they struggle. And so a lot of people have test automation, but if you look at it, they're not doing quality control charts, product control charts, cross-environment control charts. They're not labeling it right. And if you go run those experiments for a stable quality signal, most won't pass. And so take the time to do that, look at building in quality. And if you go into, I'm really skeptical about this approach, but I'm optimistic that it maybe is going to get there. And that is, there may be other companies, but I've looked at Advance, and they do AI-based automated testing. So the idea is that you go in and you point the artificial intelligence to an application running in production, and it automatically creates all your step definitions and everything else. Has anybody tried it?
Yeah, we've looked at it at Verizon with Mabel. M-A-B-L is another form of that same concept. you can hook it up to Dynatrace, which is your instrumentation software, and it'll listen to the playbacks from Dynatrace on the production environment, and it'll actually form out test cases in an AI fashion. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about that. What I don't know is what's different about software from manufacturing is in manufacturing, every time you run the manufacturing process, you're trying to create the exact same thing. And every time you run the manufacturing process of software for create an environment, deploy the code, build the code, doing everything like that, the product's changed. So as the application changes, can you change the testing at the same rate of the product so that you can use it as a good quality gate? That's the big one that's unknown for me out there.
All right. Bjorn, you're up next.
Hey, thank you, Gary. Thanks for your time. This was a very insightful presentation, and thanks, Dion and Brian, for setting this up. So my question was, I know you approached this from a delivery pipeline for a very tightly coupled application. Would that be a recommendation, or would you give them, let's decouple and have them independently go to production?
Yeah, if you can decouple, it's great, right? If you read the what's the unicorn project, right? It's all, hey, I got a new environment and I did this thing on my database and all of a sudden I'm decoupled. That's just sometimes pretty hard. And what I say is let's document what we have now and let's put up some guardrails with some test automation and good deployment pipeline in that piece. And once you have the guardrails, then start to evolutionary change the architecture. But like this major rewrite, maybe, but if you've got a large monolith, how many microservices do you have to get going before you're ready to really have the business benefit? So if you can do it, yeah, great. It's always going to be more efficient and better. It's just, having done that with 10 million lines of code and 400 developers for LaserJet printers, it was the hardest, most difficult thing I've ever done. I don't easily wish that approach on somebody, especially without a good deployment pipeline for guardrails while you're doing it. But I caution hardly against major rewrites. I'm much more interested in evolutionary architectural changes to enable decoupling.
All right. Next up is Jim Lowry.
Hey, Gary, Jim Lowry. Thanks for the talk. Really appreciate it. My question to you is, I think when Brian made us aware of your certification, I think I read up on it a little bit. If I recall, I think there's like a leader track or a leader certification.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about like what is in that and how is that different than like your engineer track?
It's the only difference is the leader track has more on planning process and how to modify your planning process to take care of the unique advantages of software, unique characteristics. And it has more on the role of the one thing you talked about, which deployment pipelines do we want to pick to go after, and how do we staff that with leaders that are going to lead the continuous improvement journey. So it describes more the leader's role than it describes the other. It's $50 more, and I'll probably send you guys the certification for leaders, just because I think as a dojo community, you ought to see what I'm thinking they should learn. And then just think of the practitioners as just being everything but the last two modules.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Jesse Getsy.
Oh, I'm gonna step away.
Yeah,
I gotta
my
let
question.
my dog in real quick.
Okay.
All right. They got a demanding dog that had foot surgery, so I'm just not letting her scratch at the door with a broken foot.
No worries. Hey, Gary, my question was around the suggested skill sets or prereqs to begin the training, or really thinking about reframing that question like the target audience. Is it junior engineers, senior engineers, all of the above?
I think senior engineers and managers. What do you think, Brian and Dana?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think you have to have some context around what your problems are. So yeah, absolutely. Senior engineers and managers, it would be, senior engineers all the way up to, SVP really, is what I would target that for sure. I think junior engineers kind of lack the context what the problems are to really understand.
Sure.
And it's not technical. So, you know, the head of training at Walmart really took the time to figure out how to get it and learn it and learn the context. And she scored the highest score of anybody that's gone through the white belt training so far. Sorry, Dave. So if you want to learn, you can take it. You can figure it out, and it's not so much teaching you guys, but it's thinking of the idea of what if all your peers had your level of understanding about how to think about this and the types of things that could be improved.
Okay, James Simon, you had another question, I believe, about books. Probably a good follow-up to this one.
Yeah, so just Gary, in my organization, there are some of these software issues, but the bigger issue is a little bit more just in our process. And I'm wondering if you have recommendations on how to get to the point of writing code faster. You know, like with requirements, bureaucracy, product planning, right? It takes us a long time to get to where anybody's actually writing any code. Never mind deploying and putting it out in the market. So
that's that one module that's in the leaders group that's around planning. And I think what I see most people do is requirements are just like inventory, and it builds up in the system. And I think the biggest error that we see people doing is having way too much work in process for requirements. And we need to be clear about what the purpose of the requirements are. We may want to just capture them by name, a very low investment, don't worry about it. To prioritize them better, we may need to do a t-shirt sizing. If we're holding people accountable for accuracy of that t-shirt sizing, then it's going to take a lot more effort. But if we're just using it to prioritize things and we're not going to go back and hold people accountable for accuracy of plan, then we can do that. And then we want to just have a backlog of prioritized work that we agree that we want to work on an order. And we don't want to hold the organization accountable for optimizing accuracy of plan. We want to hold the organization accountable for optimizing flow of value to the customer. And so if we think about managing inventory, and you know, a lot of Kanban or a lot of drum buffer rope from Goldrat was all about how do we release work into the system at a rate that we don't build up excess inventory. And I think what you'd see if you did the analysis in that module is that you probably have way too much work in process in the requirements piece, and you're not very clear about the purposes of each stage of the planning you're doing. And because of that, you're trying to drive to much higher degrees of accuracy of plan than is needed to support the decision you're trying to make. But that's not something that's going to change at the low level in the organization. That's something that's going to be more likely up at that's why it's in the leaders module. But I'll give you guys free coupons to take the leaders version just so you see what's there. But that piece is covered in there along with metrics to think about. And that's the before you get to the deployment pipeline mapping. But it's, you know, how many days of supply do you have of stuff t-shirt sized? How many days of supply do you have of requirements scoped and ready for development? And how many days of supply of inventory do you have under development? You know, a lot of people end up with way too much work in process, and similar to we don't show the lines of code in inventory, we don't show the requirements, days of supply and excess inventory in the system.
All right, we've got a few more questions here, a few more minutes. A couple tactical ones first. So if the test is failing consistently, stop doing the test until the defect is believed fixed. I think he's talking about the gating and what happens when the test fails.
Well, if it's for gating, you don't remove the test, you send the code back to if it was passing on build 1 and on build 2 it doesn't pass, you don't stop the production line, you just take that code, you send it back to the developer, and you say, here's the code, you need to fix it. And ideally at HP, we did things like triage bundles. Not only here's the code, here's the automated test you can run on your desktop, and here's all the logs that we're able to scrub, and we think it might be in this area of the log file. So we did things to make them very productive at debugging and triaging, because that's a lot of where the waste and inefficiency is. And we try to get over that with smaller batch sizes, so there's less changes to look at. But we also want to do things that enables the developers to really efficiently be able to debug and triage quickly.
Okay. Should we be using the standard classifications shown on the Pareto chart?
You should be using what makes sense for your organization. I chose what I see in organizations, and the things that I see is test issues, I see deployment issues, I see environment issues, I see test data issues, I see code issues. For me, those are everything but code issues I should be able to fix with automation once and for all. And I go back to the other question of, with the AI-based test automation, can the test change at the rate the product is? So if I check in code and the test fails, is that an intended or unintended consequence? And with the automated generated one, I don't know how I tell the difference, but what's unique with software once we get good at it is enabling the process to change at the rate of the product. And that's very different than it is for manufacturing, because manufacturing, we're just doing the same product over and over again. With software, every time we check in code, we've changed the product, and the testing, or maybe even the environment part of the product process, needs to change at the same rate the product does. And that's the hard piece of why I'm kind of skeptical still about the AI-based test automation. But if you got nothing, it sure is a good way to get something quicker.
All right, I think this will be the last question for you, Gary, tonight. This is a broad topic. You've already touched on it quite a bit, but how can you change the mindset, why the change is important? Mostly when the pushback is from management. I think this is something we all wrestle with here, even justifying why companies might want to create a dojo, right? So how do you bring about that mindset change? Any final thoughts on that?
That's my goal of the white belt training, right? If you had a CIO that sort of says, all my managers need to take this training, and it's put into their learning, just like their compliance or their sexual harassment training, they've got to take it. I think they're going to see the waste and inefficiencies and want to go after it. And then when they go try to make the change, they're going to go, does anybody know what a Docker container is? I heard of this Kubernetes thing. Where do you get one of those, right? They're going to realize over time that they need people with those capabilities to help, because you don't want every team learning that independently, because you can develop bad design patterns. So when I do workshops, I typically get people excited about what to do, and then I bring a technical guy with me, and we spend the next 2 days them trying to stand up a deployment pipeline and running into all the things, and everybody standing around doing it, which is kind of what you guys are doing with the Dojo over longer form and a longer supportable thing. But once they get excited about doing stuff, we don't want to watch them get frustrated and give up by struggling with the new technology and the new tools. We need to be able to assist them and help them with that. So that's kind of where they're at.
Can I add something?
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so, one of the things that when I was reading Gary's book for the first time, I think one of the things that really struck me was that this was my way to translate to all the business school graduates who are running software development organizations. The information to explain the software development is manufacturing, and how to translate back and forth, and that they're doing things that just generate waste and costing the company money. And if they just understood that slightly better and were able to apply their business school background for manufacturing to software development, they would see that what we're talking about is a way to reduce costs for the company and protect profits.
So I have one more question, and this is from me to you guys. You're all fighting the good fight. I've done that. I know how hard what you're trying to do is in making the changes. I've tried all the different things I can to do to help you, whether it's webinars or books or DevOps or this training or whatever. What am I missing that would enable you to be successful. Try the training, see if that gets you there, and if that's there, and if you think about how to get it into people and get them to take it, great. If it isn't that, what is it? Because this is my passion, this is my energy, this is where I'm spending all my time trying to help people like you. And if what I'm doing isn't that, I need to figure out what that is, because that's where my passion and energy is, and that's where I want to help. And send me emails, GaryGruver.com. I'll work with Dion to try to figure out the best way to get you a coupon. It's going to be a different coupon for each person, so I got to figure out how to do that. So if you guys, he copied me on your distribution list, but I'm very sensitive about that's your community, and I don't want to invade that community unless I'm invited in. But if I'm invited in, I would be willing to send you a coupon in that piece. If you'd rather send me an email and I'll send it to you. The person who's created it for me and is distributing it has agreed I can give away 2 free per company. If you really need a third, send me out, I'll arm wrestle with them and see if I can get it for you. But whatever the best way to get that for you is, because I think it would make your job easier. So.
Okay, so we'll make sure somehow via Slack, LinkedIn group, or just the email kind of list that Roger Serby has, we'll get this information to everyone. If for some reason you don't hear from me and or Gary or Brian or someone within a week, please ping me. Again, here's my email address in chat, and we'll make sure we get all the pertinent info to you. Brian, any final thoughts to wrap up, since you're the one who kind of organized this and got Gary on board?
No, I'd just like to thank everybody for showing up. I know I've gotten a lot of value from talking to Gary over the years, and I hope everybody else does too. I count him among one of my mentors and friends at this point. So he's been extremely generous with his time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I'd buy him beer, but I can't because he works for Walmart.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Gary, and thanks everyone else. Keep your eyes open for hopefully another event like this the last Tuesday of May.
Just a quick thanks to Dion and Joel for putting this together for us. Greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much.